Edouard Manet's Olympia would trigger one of the fiercest scandals in the history of 19th century art. The critic would recognise in this nude a gorilla, the filthiest and lowliest representation of Parisian prostitution. She sold coal, a beast that was best to ignore, since she virtually petrified critics and made them impotent. Our proposal is that Olympia caused outrage because it uncovered 3 taboos: a philosophical taboo, a social and a sexual one. Let's begin with the first of our 3 taboos, that of philosophy.
Of the 80 contemporary critics, only 2 were capable of iconographical study of the painting, despite that being the whole point of their job. Edouard Manet studied art. He was bourgeois and had the means to travel. Between 1852 and 53, he went to Europe, visiting the Netherlands and Germany.
Il se rend à Amsterdam, il se rendra en Allemagne et en 53
and in 53 to Italy, where he copied the Venus of Urbino.
va copier la Vénus d'Urbino.
As I was saying, only 2 of 80 critics established this link between Olympia and the Venus of Urbino, which should have been obvious to all. Let me explain. Here is Manet's copy of the Venus of Urbino from his 1853 stay in Italy. If we were studying the Venus of Urbino, which isn't today's purpose, I would certainly mention its erotic function. But centuries had passed, some 320 years in fact, since she was first painted in 1538, and her erotic language had eroded. Rather, her pictorial language had become a paragon of academic nudes. She was derived from Giorgione's Sleeping Venus, which means that an affiliation probably occurred between one Venus and the other before we even get to Olympia. Let us now put these paintings side by side, because when we see them like this, the link is obvious. You have 2 naked women in similar positions, crossing their legs in the same way. Of course, our Italian woman is a little more nonchalant. Her head is cast down and her hands are smoother, while Olympia is more rigid and poses with a firmer hand. Their beds match. They both have creased sheets and are on a double mattress, supported by 2 pillows, a green curtain tucked up in the left corner, while the backgrounds are cut off by a partition. I would say that Titian, with his Venus, was showing the intellectual superiority of humanism by simulating 3-dimensionality on a 2-dimensional canvas. Additionally, he was capable of rendering a body more beautiful than nature could possibly create. In order to magnify this fictional 3-dimensionality and the extraordinary depth of his canvas, he even includes this little window that reveals a faraway landscape, almost in the manner of a veduta. Manet conceals this space with a curtain, leaving only a tiny opening, which has the inescapable effect of rendering a confrontation with the naked body. In both cases, we find the presence of pets and flowers, but their differences are not insignificant. The plant here is a myrtle, symbolic of conjugal fidelity and an attribute of Venus. But Manet painted, instead of it, a bunch of flowers sent from a suitor? Goodbye to conjugal fidelity's symbol, since Manet depicted the exact opposite. Furthermore, the bunch of roses in our Venus's hands, also a traditional attribute of Venus, metamorphosed into hibiscus flowers. In Paris, a hibiscus was considered to be exotic and a little artificial, as you would have needed more warmth than what the traditional Parisian climate had to offer. Remember that the figure of prostitution in the 19th century is the artifice of love, and the hibiscus becomes its attribute. In regards to the pets, the dog, a symbol of conjugal fidelity, is quietly sleeping at the bottom of Venus's bed, whereas in this instance there is a cat with his fur sticking up. I must remind you at this point that a cat is a metaphor for female genitalia, the pussy in English, and that any excess of energy in a woman's disposition was a sure sign of sexual deviance. The cat here is excitable and angry. Put two and two together and the enigma of Olympia's identity seems to solve itself. I think this iconographical study is not only obvious but also informative, yet only two critics established a link between Titian and Manet. They could have gone further. Look at this painting by Rembrandt, Bathsheba, which was in Louis Lecaus's collection, the man who helped Olympia get into the Salon.
La même qui avait favorisé l'entrée au Salon d'Olympia. Alors j'y pense à ce...
Rembrandt's Bathsheba only has one shoe on, just like Manet's.
Comme dans Olympia.
Olympia is thus placed in a classic academic filiation. But this filiation is damaging. Remember the cat? It is perverting the untouchable academic nude, whereas the nude had been the apotheosis of academic pride ever since the Renaissance. To understand this, we need to go back and ask ourselves why. Why did the nude embody academic pride? Why was it untouchable?
On va faire un petit saut en arrière.
1400 will serve as an approximate temporal marker. Before this date, we have the centuries of faith, between 350 and 1350, which was succeeded by a new period of so-called humanism that was brought about by a change of paradigm. During the centuries of faith, man considered himself first and foremost a sinner. He wasn't at the system's centre because at the centre was God. Instead, he was at the margins because his nature, far from being divine, was of sin.
Du système se trouve Dieu, il est à la marge parce qu'il est pécheur. Et il produit...
Mankind produced great works and beautiful objects, but often to fulfill a function, and this function was to transmit the holy message of the liturgy. It is, however, important to remember that works during this period weren't signed, since the sinner was not deserving of being renowned as an illustrious craftsman. And as for thoughts about antiquity during this time, it was despised. When man wasn't trying to destroy it, he was at least trying to forget it. The years of the Roman Empire's conversion to Christianity were great periods of iconoclasm, as well as the prohibition of antique rites under Constantine and Theodosius I. By the 1400s, there was, as I was saying, a change in paradigm brought about by the ascent of humanism. Remember the Vitruvian man borrowed by Leonardo da Vinci, a perfectly proportioned man inscribed within a circle, an architect and measure of the world. In this system, man was no longer at the margins. He was no longer a sinner of centuries past. He became this perfect being created by God in his image, incarnating his perfection, or at least displaying his divine potential. This new potential was expressed through humanism, whether it was erudite or artistic, and from being a sinner he became rational, a liberal artist. He didn't simply produce beautiful, functional objects anymore, but instead created artworks that were tangible proof of his intelligence. And the ultimate proof of this change in paradigm was what I call the apotheosis of image, the nude. We were made in the image of God, thus fabricated from holy essence rather than sin. Strong from our half-holiness, we dared God on his own grounds. You know the phrase, and God said, "Let there be light, earth, sea, birds." He created man and then woman. So, what better way of defying God than on his own grounds? Creation. In order to do so, it was necessary to copy divine creations and idealize them. In other words, to do a better job than him. This is what Alberti said in De Pintura at the end of the 1530s. He explained that one had to copy nature, but most importantly, to better it, to idealize it. It was a challenge to God by the Renaissance liberal artist to do better than him. But God's best creation was the human body of man and woman. It was obvious then that the artist would go on to defy God by way of his best creation. Our humanists copied him by magnifying the body, and hence the importance of the nude. But the nude was a challenge, and the proof of man's reassignment in his system. A further point to note is that artists took their model from antiquity, which they so admired. Except that, in doing so, they would also defy antiquity. Antiquity as we know it worked mostly in the three-dimensional, with sculptures. But how can sculpture be defined? Humanists aspired only to equal Greek beauty, but they defined it by working only on the two-dimensional surface of the canvas, a handicap that made the task more difficult. So, despite the technical problems presented by depicting a body on a flat canvas, they sought to emulate antique proportion, harmony, and beauty, despite the technical difficulties implied by representing a body on a flat surface. This is how the nude was established as sacrosanct and became known as the essential academic figure drawing. The expression faire ses academies refers to the method of learning how to draw figures as it was taught at the Beaux-Arts. To learn how to draw a nude, one would first copy reproductions of paintings in workshops or at the Louvre. So the nude was a double defiance and a double proof of man's superiority. Through the image of a nude, man defies both God and antiquity. Then the following year, students sketched from statues in order to finally, in the final year before graduating, use live models. Let's briefly recap. Academic painting considered figure drawing to be a witness of human intelligence. I wonder if you recognise this. Here we have The Romans of Decadence from 1847, which leads me to believe that this photograph was taken at the 1855 Universal Exhibition, when the state exhibited its acquisitions. I'll show you the position of the paintings, forming 1, 2, 3, or even 4 rows if space permitted, or they could be placed on the floor. Take note of the omnipresent nude. You have some here, here, and here. Another is mid-contortion. The nude was omnipresent in the Salon's paintings, and it was these which swiped medals. Here is a view of the Great Salon, dedicated to Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres at the Universal Exhibition of 1855. We recognise his Valperson bather, Birth of Venus, and Grande Odalisque, today displayed at the Louvre, and even a Napoleon as a nude Apollo. Our academics were extremely proud of these nudes since they testified to academic men's superiority. In 1865, that is to say the year of the Olympia scandal, the state bought its normal number of paintings at the Salon. In addition to the portrait of Emperor Napoleon III, this time clothed, here are 2 shots of some of the purchases, 8 of which were nudes. You have a nude, another nude, a nude again, and another. Whereas here there is a little more chastity, displaying Adam and Eve who have become conscious of their nudities since being banished from paradise and ended up getting dressed. So why was a painting like Olympia so shocking? Perhaps it was no more than one nude amongst many others. Or maybe not. The word nu in French is confusing. You would say to a child, don't run around in the nude, in the same way that you would speak of the figure drawings. But if common French had the same precision as English for this matter, there wouldn't be this confusion. We'd say nude for the academic nude, and, like in English, we'd say naked for the state of undress. Sure, there is déshabillé to mean undress, but it isn't used often. It's exactly what Kenneth Clark wrote at the beginning of his formidable work, The Nude. The English language, with its elaborate generosity, distinguishes between the naked and the nude. And he continued, the word nude, on the other hand, carries in educated usage no uncomfortable overtone. But the equivocal duplicity of the term nu in French similarly refers to both the nude and the naked. The great masters of academia and critics remind us of the rules of the nude. Let's begin with Maxime Duchamp, who says, art should have no more sex than mathematics. And of the nude, he says that it is the abstract being, and thus it must preoccupy and tempt the artist above all. But to clothe the nude in immodesty, to give the facial features all those expressions which are not spoken, that is, to dishonour the nude and to do something disputable. Lemonnier, in 1870, also gave his version of the rules for nudes. The nude is not the same as the undressed, and nothing is less nude than a woman emerging from her pair of drawers or one who has just taken off her chemise. An undressed woman is therefore not a nude, an absurdity of common French, as we use the term interchangeably. The nude has modesty only if it is not a transitory state. It hides nothing because there is nothing to hide. The moment it hides something, it becomes prurient, for in reality it shows it all the better. In order to stay a virgin, the nude in art must be impersonal and must not particularize. We start to understand the unease surrounding Olympia. The pierreuses from Paul Niquet had been unveiled, which meant that this nude was no longer a nude because it became prurient. That is to say, it became too interested in other people's sexual behaviour. Viewers could recognise the face of the models. On the left is Victorine Moreau, who was probably Manet's mistress, and on the right, a woman popularly known as Laure. So here we have a particular street, which is an extremely problematic juxtaposition when placed alongside the idea that the nude should be a mathematical abstraction. It hides nothing and shows nothing. The undressed, on the contrary, always reminds me of the woman who shows herself off for 40 sous. Here's our pierreuse, recognised, named, undressed, and above all, prurient. The art teacher of Manet, Charles Gleyre, painted Sappho in 1867, right in the midst of the Olympia's years of scandal. He allegedly said to Manet, "Remember, young man, that when one draws a figure, one should always think of the antique." I will add 2 points to this. First, that in order to paint a nude rather than a naked figure, it is better to rely on a stylistic distance that comes with the fini, the smooth finish of academic painting. Remember that when the trace of the paintbrush is visible, matter also becomes visible, and priority is given to matter above image. However, what academic painters were looking for was a perfect illusion. Materiality was a reminder of the physicality, which meant, in the context of the nude, the state of undress and the exposure of flesh. So, when painting a nude, it would absolutely have to respect a finished and smoothed out academic style. Second, one would have to distance themselves from the subject in order not to recognise women from the streets. Gleyre spoke of the antique, but in fact there were 2 possibilities. Temporal distance could be created using the 2,000-year-old antique nude as a model, or geographical distance could be created by using the Orientalist figure and its faraway harems. Now, let's continue with Alphonse Lecadre, reclining nude. It was the same Lemonnier who had said that an academic nude had nothing to hide, who also wrote enthusiastically about a nude by Lecadre, I suppose about this particular one. The breast is well realised. One sees its lassitude, the mark of embrace upon it, the traces of kisses, and the breast hand down, pulled out of shape by pleasure. Therefore, I find it difficult to follow Lemonniere's logic. He wrote that the nude was a mathematical abstraction. Therefore, my question is simple. Can you embrace a mathematical abstraction? But something isn't clear to me. While Duchamp wrote that art should have no more sex than mathematics, he also adds, Monsieur Ingres has treated nudity in all its splendour, and never in a single trait has he strayed from the purest chastity. Once again, these very chaste paintings were being judged. Let me remind you of the conditions of Venus's birth, represented in the Venus Anaiodomene. Venus was brought into being by way of an almost immaculate conception. She was born from Uranus, whose genitals had been sectioned by his son and thrown into the sea. The genitals subsequently boiled and discharged a foam that was none other than his seminal fluid, and from this, Venus was born. All of this is chaste, of course, and displaying a smooth academic style supplied by mythical discourse. Depictions of Venus Anaiodomene were popular with the public and the state, who, judging by their register of 1865 or 1879, had many in their collections. Here we have William Bouguereau's version from the state's 1879 acquisition. It was admired, and he was a regular Salon medalist, of course. There is another critic whose writing concerns the great Cabanel and his nymph abducted by a satyr. Monsieur Cabanel is one of those who stays true to the noble quest for the pagan ideal. Monsieur Cabanel has stopped at just the moment when the work would have lost its nobility. It would be right before it lost its nobility. I remind you that abduction was a recurrent euphemism for rape, as with the abduction of Europa. To be more precise, Zeus abducted her, charmed her, and then raped her. So here we have a satyr abducting a nymph. Didn't Cabanel show the moment right before the rape? Luckily, Cabanel stopped in time, and its nobility was preserved. In 1863, that is to say, the year Manet dealt with the scandal surrounding the luncheon on the grass and painted Olympia, Cabanel presented the birth of Venus at the Salon and won a medal.
Alexandre Cabanel présente au Salon avec un grand succès puisqu'il remporte une médaille au
Here is what Théophile Gautier had to say about this. Her divine body seems moulded into the snowy form of the waves. The tip of her breasts, her mouth and cheeks are tinted with an imperceptible nuance of pink. The only thing that interested him was form and shades of pink. A drop of the crimson ambrosia spills in this silver and vaporous substance, of which you know the seminal origin.
Toujours sur ce même tableau, Monsieur Cabanel écrit,
Still on the same subject, Louis Offray, who was so critical of Manet, wrote that Cabanel charms and seduces without exciting desires. What we admire here is the elegance of form, the correction of drawing, the finesse and freshness of the colouring. It's less nature than the Pearl by Baudry, but it's more purely poetically beautiful. So continuously, it was the academic form of drawing rather than the form of the flesh that was admired in the various births of Venus.
mais surtout pas les formes de la chair.
Here is the painting Offray was speaking of. From an iconographical point of view, we recognise a birth of Venus. She's in the nude, placed by the water near foam and shells. All her attributes are present. It is titled The Pearl and the Wave, more or less referencing a distant Persian text.
Un lointain texte persan.
One way of abstracting flesh to achieve the nude was by having a reliance on geographical distance, typically displayed in nude odalisques.
Les odalisques dans les arêtes.
I chose this one by François-Léon Benouville since the painting structure is quite similar to Olympia, although she isn't in the nude. You have a dressed odalisque in the presence of a black servant.
Ce que vous retrouvez ici, une odalisque jaune, nous dit-on, en présence de la servante noire.
Here is another by Ingres, odalisque with slave. The contortions of this odalisque remind me of ballet dancers, despite this supposedly being a mathematical abstraction.
N'oublions pas, nous sommes dans la logique de l'abstraction mathématique.
Here we have Le Grand Odalisque by Ingres. Not so long ago, the Louvre catalogue stated that Ingres scorns anatomic truth. It's true that her backbone is too long and her breasts displaced, as if to profit a timeless and abstract art. Which means that today, in the 21st century, we still speak of abstraction and timelessness when we address academic nudes. Jean-Léon Gérôme, another great academic artist, painted the Greek interior. Here you have a mix of Oriental interiors, probably influenced by the mosaics in prostitute houses from Pompeii, with what we call a Venus erotica. We speak of Venus pudica when Venus's hand covers her genitals, while Venus erotica is when her arms are up and her genitals exposed. You can see this nude from every angle, front, profile, three-quarter profile. This one, coincidentally, is lying on a lion. We will come back to this, but note that lionesses were what grand courtesans were also called. Let us continue through with the artist's work, Phryane before the Areopagus. Phryane was hetero, that is to say, a sacred prostitute who, accused of impiety, risked being condemned to capital punishment by the Areopagus, when her orator Hypocrisy had the great idea of removing her drapes covering her nudity. Facing such beauty, the Areopagus members acquitted her. We admire it, but, as was to be expected of Émile Zola, when the painting was shown again in 1867, he ended up revealing the theatrical and non-abstract nature of this Phryane.
Reconnaît qu'en 61, la critique avait été très en faveur, mais lorsqu'il est remontré en remontré...
Zola said that her gesture was a single surprising move, like a modern mistress changing her chemise, which means that he was bringing her into a profane reality, a little prostitute, gaily flirting while dropping her clothes. And he added in regard to the wise men, these rows of old faces turned on by desire. Look at the close-ups of these old faces. One is sucking his thumb, another is completely subjugated. This one seems to be asking God for help, whereas this figure has a lustful gaze of an aging concupiscence. Observe his sagging bust that contrasts with Phryne's marble whiteness.
Libidineux et concupissant évident dont la poitrine tombe, marquant l'âge face à la jeune chair blanche de marbre de Phryné. Parce que là encore, vous avez une émulation.
Once again, the paintbrush was challenging Greek marbles.
Celle du statuaire grec. Et on est allé encore plus loin. Au XIXe siècle, on a
The academic success was such that Phryne statues were produced, and this mathematical abstraction could thus be toyed with.
On pouvait la tripoter en direct à travers cette statuette. Alors,
the same Zola didn't spare the birth of the prestigious Cabanel either.
Lorsqu'il s'agit de cette naissance de Vénus. Et voilà ce qu'il dit.
He spoke of a goddess drowned in a sea of milk, who looked like a delicious lorette. But who were these lorettes? They were prostitutes, mostly clandestine, who were active in the Chaussée d'Antin neighbourhood, towards the Rue Brenda, right next to the Notre-Dame Lorette church, hence the Lorette Saubriguette. Zola recognised here the delicious lorette, not of skin and bone, it would be too indecent, but a sort of pink and white almond paste. Academic art had become pastries and cream. For supposed liberal art, it's quite daring. What Zola was denouncing is obvious. Our academics hid their lorettes in pink and white almond paste settings. We shall end now with Castagnery, a critic who was close to the realists and who attacked Baudry's Venus. And how much better this beautiful lady, she with the looks of a Parisian modiste or milliner, would look upon a sofa after living so well in her luxury apartment on the Chaussée d'Antin. What was a little Parisian modiste doing here? Very often, to compensate for financial insufficiencies, these little milliners, laundrywomen, called trottins, would between two deliveries practice clandestine prostitution. She can't feel quite comfortable on this rock near all those painful pebbles and sharp-pointed shells. Is she lying in wait for a millionaire on his travel to faraway places? Not without irony, he recognised that this Venus Anaeudemone was none other than a charming milliner. The women weren't to be fooled. Honoré Daumier, in 1864, commented, "This year has Venuses again, always Venuses, as if there were actual women that looked like this." These women are clearly our most lucid critics. All these Venuses were, of course, unrealistic, as if they were actual women that looked like this. But that they got offended and refused to confront them with their gaze shows that lust is depicted as a paradigmatic image of intellectual superiority. Our Olympia is a masterly demonstration of this. She denounces the corruption of academic art. She usurps traditional Venuses, despite borrowing their setting, nudity, and poses. She gives an identity to these attributes, a face, a name, the crass materiality of a prostitute. Manet made a hybrid out of the nude, creating a half-academic, half-escort, and by doing so he explicitly rendered what others were doing implicitly. One last thing that must be addressed is the emergence of a new way of seeing, that is, pornographic photography. At the beginning of the 1840s, photography was still novel, and only daguerreotypes created unique images. During the 50s and early 60s, photography invented the negative, and it was this that facilitated the dissemination of paper prints. Pornographic imagery began to circulate illicitly.
De l'image pornographique qui circule largement sous manteau.
Here you have a photo from the Register of Convicted Persons for Customs, a certain Augustine Guy called Bergère. Look at her position, leaning on both cushions. Do you not recognise her? She looks rather like Manet's Olympia, does she not? And this one, Félix Jacques Moulin's reclining nude, smiling. Manet might well have seen this kind of photography. Indeed, it would be surprising if he hadn't. It was a new way of seeing in the field of his discipline, and there was really no reason for him not to have a little look. His Olympia is simply reversed. Although her head is held a little higher, the position of her legs and her stance are very similar. Despite being left without proof, we are certain that Manet saw this new visual resource while painting his Olympia. Why wouldn't he have? He who took on the Baudelairean challenge and painted Parisian prostitution as a modern painter.
Mais je suis assez persuadée que Manet a regardé cette visualité pornographique lorsqu'il a fait son Olympia. Alors,
I hope I have convinced you that academic vocabulary was tortured, since it tried to touch upon sex at the same time as simulating mathematical abstraction. However, the message is clear. The academic nude exudes desire. Manet, with Olympia, denounced how old-fashioned the genre was. The vacuity of the paradigmatic image was supposed to incarnate the intellectual superiority of man. He denounced a hypocrisy and a mannerism, which had nothing to hide anymore, other than its reprehensible impulses. I call this the first split, a philosophical split. That is to say, a divide of a given way of thinking, torn between an official discourse of abstraction, of intellectual perfection, and an unassumed, licentious impulse. But these were certainly not unfulfilled, because Paris was nicknamed the New Babylon, which is the subject of our next chapter.
on appelle alors Paris la Nouvelle Babylone.